The town of Ironwood sat on the edge of nowhere. A quiet, forgotten place, the kind where everybody knew everybody, yet no one spoke too loudly about the things that happened after dark. The long, cracked roads were lined with aging storefronts, a single diner, and a gas station that had seen better days. But beyond the town's seemingly peaceful facade lurked an undercurrent of fear. The Black Vultures ran the streets after sundown. Their roaring bikes echoed down the highway, their leather-clad presence a constant reminder that law and order here belonged to them, not the sheriff. On the outskirts of town, a lone repair shop stood defiantly against time. It wasn't flashy, just a simple weathered garage with an old sign that read Carter's Auto Repair. Inside, amid the scent of motor oil and steel, worked a man who had once fought battles in faraway lands but now waged a quieter war against his own past. A man of few words, rugged, battle-hardened, yet weary. His hands, once trained for war, now fixed engines. His eyes, once sharp enough to track enemies in the dead of night, now carefully inspected gears and pistons. A soldier-turned-mechanic, living a simple life. And then, there was Emily Carter. 16 years old. Smart, independent, with her mother's sharp wit and her father's stubborn resilience. She loved photography, always carrying her camera slung over her shoulder, capturing the world in ways others didn't see. Jack had spent years protecting her from the world he once knew. But some dangers weren't so easily avoided, but beyond the town's seemingly peaceful facade lurked an undercurrent of fear. It was in the way store owners hurried to close shop before sunset, how quiet conversations in diners shifted when certain names were mentioned, and how the sheriff, who should have been the keeper of order, seemed to look the other way when trouble came roaring through the streets. Because trouble had a name. They owned the night. Their bikes thundered down the highways, a rolling storm of leather, chrome, and bad intentions. They weren't just a gang, they were an unspoken law. If you crossed them, you paid the price. If you got in their way, you disappeared. And the town knew better than to resist. But on the outskirts, just past the last flickering streetlight, stood something different. Something that didn't bend. A lone repair shop, Carter's Auto Repair. It wasn't much to look at. The paint had long since faded, the rusting sign barely legible, and the garage door groaned whenever it opened. But it stood there like an old soldier, worn, battered, but unyielding. Inside, the scent of motor oil and steel hung thick in the air, mixing with the distant sound of classic rock playing from an old radio. Tools were lined up in perfect order, not a single wrench out of place. The space wasn't just a shop, it was a sanctuary. And at its heart was Jack Carter. A man who had once known war and chaos, now trying to find peace in grease and gears. His hands, once trained to dismantle enemies, now rebuilt engines with the same careful precision. His reflexes, honed for survival, never fully faded. He still noticed too much, still heard things others wouldn't. Some habits never died. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his voice carried weight. He had the look of someone who had seen too much, lines of exhaustion beneath his sharp, calculating eyes. The war never truly left him. It just changed shape. The town had learned long ago that resistance was futile. The gang that ran things made sure of that. The sheriff looked the other way, the shopkeepers paid their dues, and the people kept their heads down. It was easier that way. Safer. But on the outskirts, where the town's influence thinned and the darkness felt heavier, there was one place that didn't bow. It wasn't impressive. A squat, weathered building with a roof that sagged just a little too much on one side. The neon "Open" sign in the window flickered sporadically, as if unsure whether to keep trying or just give up. The parking lot was cracked and uneven, sprouting weeds that had fought through years of neglect. A single street lamp buzzed overhead, its glow barely reaching the edge of the lot before surrendering to the night. But despite its worn appearance, the shop stood firm, like a stubborn relic of a time when men didn't scare so easy. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil, steel, and old coffee. A battered radio played something from the 70s, its volume low but steady. The tools, rows of wrenches, sockets, and screwdrivers, were arranged with military precision, everything in its rightful place. This wasn't just a workshop. It was order. It was discipline. It was Jack Carter. Jack moved like a man who had spent a lifetime on edge. Every motion was deliberate, every glance cataloging details most would miss. He didn't flinch at sudden sounds. His eyes never lingered too long in one place. Even now, years after he'd walked away from war, he carried it in his bones. His past was carved into the lines of his face, creases at his brow from too many nights spent watching doorways, shadows beneath his sharp eyes that spoke of battles that never really ended. The scars on his knuckles told their own stories, reminders of fights fought in places far from here. He didn't talk much. Didn't need to. When he did, his voice carried the weight of a man who had seen too much, done too much, and survived it all. The town feared the gang. The gang feared no one. But Jack. Jack was different. And then, there was Emily Carter. 16. Bright, independent, unshaken. She had her mother's sharp wit and her father's unyielding resilience. Where Jack saw danger, she saw possibility. Where he believed in caution, she believed in capturing the world, one photo at a time. With her camera slung over her shoulder, she saw the town through a different lens, its beauty, its secrets, its hidden stories. Photography was more than a hobby. It was how she made sense of the world. Jack had spent years shielding her from the life he once knew. The things he had done, the enemies he had made, none of it was meant to touch her. But some dangers weren't so easily avoided. Some dangers came looking for you. Jack had once been Sergeant Jack Carter, a Marine recon soldier who had seen more battles than he cared to remember. Afghanistan, Iraq, classified missions in places he couldn't name. He was good at what he did, too good. But war changed men. And Jack had seen too much. The nightmares came in flashes, gunfire, smoke, the cries of men left behind. Civilians caught in the crossfire. The weight of decisions that could never be undone. Coming home wasn't a return to peace, it was just another battlefield, one where the enemy was in his head. To escape it, he had moved to Ironwood, hoping to build something real, something that didn't involve bloodshed. His one unwavering anchor? Emily. She was his world, his reason to keep going. And if anyone ever tried to hurt her, well, God help them. Emily didn't see the world the way her father did. To her, Ironwood was small but full of stories. The sun hitting the rusted signs of old diners, the way light bounced off rain puddles after a storm, her camera caught it all. She often hung out with Danny, a local boy who worked at the gas station. He was a year older, a little awkward, but a good friend. He always looked out for her. And lately, he had been warning her. Stay away from the Black Vultures, Em. They're not just some biker gang. They own this town. People who cross them disappear. Emily had laughed it off. They're just a bunch of guys on bikes, Danny. What, you think they're the mafia or something? But deep down, she had felt it too. The way people turned away when the gang rode through town. The bruises on the faces of store owners who owed them money. The silent fear in the sheriff's eyes. Then, one day, she saw them up close. She had been wandering near the old train yard, looking for good shots when she spotted them, the Black Vultures. There were about a dozen of them, gathered around a few trucks. Large crates were being unloaded, exchanged for thick stacks of cash. It didn't take a genius to see what was happening. And like any good photographer, Emily raised her camera. Click. One picture. Click. Another. And then, she made her mistake. She stepped on a loose piece of scrap metal. Heads turned. Eyes locked onto her. And in that moment, she saw him, Rex. The Black Vulture's enforcer. A mountain of a man with a scar running down his cheek and a stare that could freeze blood. He saw her camera. Hey, kid. Rex's voice was like gravel. Hand over the camera. Emily's heart pounded. It's just pictures, she said, taking a step back. No big deal. But Rex was already moving. You don't understand, little girl, he sneered. That camera is a big problem. Emily did the only thing she could think of. She ran. She sprinted through the abandoned train yard, weaving between rusted freight cars, heart hammering in her chest. Behind her, she heard the gang shouting, engines revving up. She didn't stop running until she was home. She slammed the door shut, breathless. Jack looked up from the kitchen table, instantly reading the fear on her face. What happened? He asked, voice calm but edged with something darker. Emily hesitated. Should she tell him? No. He'd overreact. She was fine. "It was nothing. Just got spooked," she said with a small smile. "Saw a coyote." Jack's eyes lingered on her, but he didn't press. Later that night, as she lay in bed, she told herself it was over. But she was wrong. Because when the phone rang at 2 a.m., Jack answered to a voice he didn't recognize. "If you ever want to see your daughter again, don't call the cops." Jack's blood turned to ice. Emily was gone. And they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The silence was deafening. Jack stood in Emily's empty room, his pulse pounding. The bed was unmade, her camera bag lay open, but Emily was gone. The stillness in the air felt wrong, too heavy, too deliberate. Then he saw it. A single sheet of paper sat on her desk, weighted down by a small black feather. His fingers clenched the letter as he read. "Stay out of our business, Carter. She's alive, for now. Call the cops, and she won't be. You know where to find us." A slow, burning rage spread through Jack's chest. He grabbed his phone and called Sheriff Holden. The line rang and rang, until finally a tired voice picked up. "Jack, it's late. What's going on?" "They took Emily." A long pause. "Jack, listen. You don't want to do this. The Black Vultures, they run this town. The best thing you can do is wait. Maybe they just want to scare her." Jack's grip tightened around the phone. "I'm not waiting. Jack, listen to me. There are things you don't understand. These guys aren't just some street punks. They have real power, real connections. If you go after them, you'll be signing your own death warrant." Jack exhaled slowly. "Then I guess I'm already dead." He hung up. The law wasn't going to help him. He was on his own. And that was just fine. Jack wasn't just a soldier. He was recon. The kind of Marine they sent in when things got bad, when they needed someone to infiltrate, eliminate, and disappear without a trace. And tonight, those instincts roared back to life. His first step was gathering information. He retraced Emily's last known steps, heading to the train yard where she loved to take photos. It didn't take long to find her abandoned camera, half hidden beneath a pile of discarded wood. Long pause. The kind that stretched thick in the air, weighing down the conversation like a loaded gun. "Jack, listen." The voice on the other end hesitated, a mix of caution and fear. "You don't want to do this. The Black Vultures, they run this town. The best thing you can do is wait. Maybe they just want to scare her." Jack's jaw clenched. His knuckles turned white around the phone. Waiting wasn't an option. Not when it was his daughter. "I'm not waiting. Jack, listen to me." The man's voice became urgent, pleading. "There are things you don't understand. These guys aren't just some street punks. They have real power, real connections. If you go after them, you'll be signing your own death warrant." Jack exhaled slowly. Controlled. Calculated. Deadly. "Then I guess I'm already dead." He hung up. For a moment, only silence remained. No police sirens. No cavalry coming. Just the empty hum of the garage's flickering light and the faint creak of the wind pushing against the rusted walls. The law wasn't going to help him. He was on his own. And that was just fine. Because Jack wasn't just a soldier. He was recon. The kind of Marine they sent in when things got bad, when they needed someone to infiltrate, eliminate, and disappear without a trace. He had spent years tracking enemies through jungles and war zones, dismantling threats before they even knew he was there. And tonight, those instincts roared back to life. He moved like a man possessed, throwing on a worn tactical jacket, sliding a blade into his boot, and pocketing a flashlight. His movements were deliberate, muscle memory taking over. Jack replayed Emily's routine in his mind. He knew her habits, her favorite places, the train yard. She loved photographing the rusted locomotives, capturing the way light cut through the steel bones of forgotten industry. That was his first stop. The air was colder here. The smell of oil and metal lingered, mixed with the damp scent of old wood and time itself. The tracks stretched into darkness, disappearing beneath the heavy fog that curled around abandoned rail cars. And then, something caught his eye. Half hidden beneath a pile of discarded wood, her camera. Jack's pulse spiked as he crouched, lifting it with careful hands. It was scuffed, the strap twisted. Too much dust for it to have been dropped recently. Jack's grip tightened around the camera. A slow exhale escaped his lips as his mind processed what this meant. Emily never left her camera behind. It was an extension of her, always slung over her shoulder, always within reach. The strap was frayed, the lens cap missing. This wasn't an accident. Someone had been here. Someone had taken her. His eyes flicked up, scanning the yard. The train yard was a graveyard of rusted giants, their hollowed-out frames casting long, jagged shadows in the mist. The wind carried the distant creak of metal, the soft clang of something shifting in the dark. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to act, but not yet. He needed more. A trail. A sign. Jack crouched lower, brushing his fingers against the dirt and gravel. There, beneath the wooden planks, tracks. Not train tracks. Boot prints. Deep, erratic impressions, scattered like a struggle had taken place. Someone had dragged something, or someone, through here. The scuff marks led toward the far side of the yard, where a chain-link fence stood bent and broken at the edges. Jack straightened, rolling his shoulders as the familiar tension settled in. His pulse slowed, not out of fear, but focus. This was the part he was built for. He moved quickly but silently, following the disturbed earth, the faint drag lines that wove between the rusted hulks of forgotten machinery. The deeper he went, the heavier the silence became. Something was off. Then he saw it. A smear of something dark along the side of a rail car. A handprint. Small. Emily's. Jack clenched his jaw. They had hurt her. His fingers curled into fists, but he forced himself to think, to breathe. Rage was a weapon, but only if wielded correctly. He pressed 2 fingers to the handprint. Still tacky. Fresh. They weren't far. Jack exhaled once, long and slow, and pulled his knife from his boot. He wasn't just going to find them. He was going to make them regret ever touching her. Someone had left it here. His gut twisted. Jack powered it on, flipping through the photos. And then, he saw it. The last image Emily had captured before she vanished. A group of men. Leather jackets. Black Vultures insignia. And in the corner of the frame, one man staring directly into the lens. Jack's grip tightened. Now he knew exactly who had taken his daughter. And exactly where he was going next. Jack turned it on. Click. The first photo showed a group of Black Vultures unloading crates from an unmarked truck. Click. The second, stacks of cash changing hands. Click. The third, a close-up of Rex, the gang's enforcer, locking eyes with the camera. And then, the final image, blurred, chaotic, but unmistakable, Emily running. Jack felt something cold settle inside him. They hadn't taken her at random. She had seen something she shouldn't have. Which meant they weren't planning to let her go. His hands clenched into fists. They thought he was just a mechanic. But they had just woken up the man he used to be. Jack needed intel. And there was only one man in town who could give it to him. A former intelligence officer turned bar owner, Mason had connections in places most people didn't even know existed. If anyone had dirt on the Black Vultures, it was him. Jack walked into Mason's bar, the Rusted Bullet, and immediately felt the weight of a dozen eyes on him. This was neutral ground. Bikers, ex-cons, and drifters all knew the rules. No fights. No weapons. Just business. Mason stood behind the counter, polishing a glass. He was older now, hair grayer, but his eyes were just as sharp. "Jack Cotter," he said with a smirk. "Didn't think I'd see you here again." "I need information," Jack said. Mason sighed. "About the Vultures, I'm guessing." Jack nodded. Mason set the glass down. "Listen, Jack. I know you're pissed. But Victor Steele isn't just some gang leader. He's a damn warlord. Ex-con, ex-mercenary. Built the Black Vultures from nothing. Runs them like a military unit. You go after him, and you're not coming back." Jack's voice was calm. "Where's their base?" Mason hesitated. "Jack, if you go there, you better be ready to burn it all down. Because they won't let you walk away." "I wasn't planning on walking away." Mason sighed, then slid a napkin across the counter. A hand-drawn map of the Vultures' compound. A heavily guarded fortress in the woods. Barbed wire. Armed guards. Security cameras. It wouldn't be easy. Jack didn't need easy. He just needed a way in. Jack's first target was T-Bone, a lower-ranking vulture known for running his mouth when drunk. Jack waited until he stumbled out of a dive bar, then followed him into an alley. He struck fast. A brutal chokehold, cutting off air before T-Bone could scream. "Where's my daughter?" Jack growled. T-Bone gasped, his hands clawing at Jack's arm. "I don't know, man." Jack tightened his grip. "Try again." T-Bone's face turned red. "Victor's got her. The compound. She's there." "Where?" "The basement. They keep prisoners there." Jack didn't let him finish. A quick strike to the temple knocked him out cold. He had what he needed. But the vultures weren't done with him yet. As Jack stepped out of the alley, he heard the low growl of motorcycles. 3 bikers. Leather jackets, chains wrapped around their fists. One of them smirked. "You messed with the wrong people, old man." Jack's muscles coiled. "No," he said quietly. "You did." The first biker lunged. Jack sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, and twisted. Snap. A scream. The second swung a chain. Jack ducked, drove an elbow into his ribs, then slammed his head against the brick wall. Out cold. The third hesitated. Jack stared him down. "Go back to your boss. Tell him I'm coming." The biker scrambled onto his motorcycle and sped off. Jack exhaled. His pulse was steady. And he wasn't stopping until Emily was safe. The Black Vultures' compound was a fortress. High fences, security cameras, armed guards patrolling in pairs. But every fortress had weak points. Jack had spent his entire life finding them. From a distance, hidden in the tree line, he studied their movements. Patterns. Timing. Gaps in their defenses. A section of fence near the rear entrance, partially covered by thick brush, out of direct view from the security cameras. Jack moved fast, cutting through the fence with wire clippers. He slipped inside, low and silent, pressing against the shadows. A guard turned the corner. Jack struck, wrapping an arm around his neck and choking him out before he could make a sound. He dragged the unconscious body behind a stack of crates. One down. He continued forward, weaving through the compound like a ghost. Another guard stood near a side door, smoking. Jack didn't give him a chance to react. One swift strike to the throat, then a silent takedown. He snatched the guard's keycard. The door clicked open. Jack slipped inside. He was getting closer. Emily sat in a dimly lit, musty basement. The air was thick with gasoline and sweat, the walls lined with rusted chains and old equipment. Victor Steele leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. His scarred face twisted into a smirk. "Your old man should have stayed out of this, girl." Emily glared at him. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Victor chuckled. "Oh, I know exactly who he is. A washed-up Marine. A mechanic." He stepped closer. "And now, a dead man walking." Emily's jaw clenched. "You're wrong." Victor tilted his head. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" She smirked. "Because he's already here." A gunshot rang out. Then another. Then chaos. Jack moved fast, gun drawn, taking out guards before they even knew what hit them. Silenced shots. Thud. Another body dropped. Then the alarm blared. They knew. Bikers swarmed the area, rifles raised, barking orders. Jack took cover behind a stack of barrels as bullets tore through the air. He grabbed a smoke grenade from his belt and tossed it. Boom! Thick gray fog engulfed the area. The vultures coughed, disoriented. Jack used the distraction, moving through the haze like a phantom. A biker came too close. Jack grabbed him, twisted his arm, and fired his own weapon into his chest. More came. Jack ran and gunned, ducking behind cover, using every piece of his military training. Explosions rocked the compound. He grabbed a detonator from his pocket. Time to make some noise. Click. A fuel tank near the garage erupted into a fireball, sending bikers scrambling. Jack didn't stop. He was a force of nature, cutting through the gang like a storm. Then, through the chaos, he spotted the basement door. Emily was inside, and Victor was waiting. Jack kicked the door open. Victor stood over Emily, a knife to her throat. "Drop it," Victor growled. Jack's gun stayed steady. No hesitation. No fear. "You won't make it out of here, Steele." Victor smirked. "Neither will you." Then, he shoved Emily aside and lunged. Jack dodged, barely avoiding the blade. The knife slashed through his sleeve, drawing blood. But Jack didn't stop. He grabbed Victor's wrist, twisted, crack. The knife clattered to the ground. Victor roared in pain, swinging wildly. Jack ducked, countered with a brutal gut punch that sent Victor stumbling. But Victor was tough. He grabbed a metal pipe and swung. Jack barely dodged as it whistled past his head. Jack rolled, grabbed a loose chain, and wrapped it around Victor's throat. Victor gasped, struggled, but Jack didn't let go. "This is for Emily." With one final twist, Victor collapsed. It was over. Jack turned to Emily, cutting her loose. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, eyes wide. "Told you," she said with a smirk. "They messed with the wrong guy." Jack grinned. "Let's go home." Smoke billowed into the night sky, painting the heavens with streaks of orange and black. The Black Vultures compound was in ruins, the inferno consuming everything they had built through fear and violence. Jack and Emily stumbled through the debris, her arms wrapped tightly around his as he guided her toward safety. "Dad," Emily whispered, her voice shaky but relieved. Jack turned to her, his normally hardened expression softening for the first time in years. He cupped her face gently, brushing away the dirt and dried tears. "I've got you, kiddo. It's over." She threw her arms around him, holding on like she never wanted to let go. Jack, despite the pain radiating from his bruised ribs, held her just as tight. For the first time since the nightmare began, they were safe. But then, the sound of approaching vehicles. Jack tensed, shielding Emily behind him as headlights cut through the smoky darkness. Then a familiar voice called out, "Relax, Carter. It's me, Mason." The former intelligence officer stepped out of his truck, flanked by a few trustworthy lawmen, the kind that weren't afraid to take a stand. Jack exhaled, finally allowing himself to lower his guard. "Took you long enough," he said gruffly. Mason chuckled. "Looks like you handled things just fine." He glanced around at the destruction. "Hell of a mess you made." Jack smirked, but his eyes remained serious. "No loose ends." Mason shook his head. "Not anymore. My guys will clean up what's left." Jack nodded. Justice had been served. The Black Vultures were finished. Emily stepped forward. "What about the corrupt cops? The ones who let this happen?" Mason smirked. "Don't worry. They're about to have a very bad night." Jack placed a reassuring hand on Emily's shoulder. "Then it's done." And with that, he led Emily away from the wreckage. They didn't look back. The drive home was quiet, the rhythmic hum of the truck's engine the only sound between them. Emily rested her head against the window, eyes heavy with exhaustion. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She turned to Jack, her voice soft. "Are you okay?" Jack exhaled, adjusting the bandage wrapped around his arm. He had faced death more times than he could count, but this was different. "I will be," he said finally. Emily hesitated before adding, "I'm sorry for everything. If I had just—" Jack shook his head, stopping her. "You have nothing to be sorry for, kid." He glanced at her, eyes full of pride and something deeper, admiration. "You were brave, strong, just like your mom." Emily smiled at the mention of her late mother, a warmth spreading through her chest. "So were you," she said. Jack chuckled. "Yeah, well, let's not make a habit of this kind of thing." She grinned. "No promises." The weight of the past few days hung heavy, but something else settled in, peace. The nightmare was over. And though they had both been changed by it, one thing remained the same. They had each other. As the truck rumbled down the open road, away from the wreckage, away from the past, Emily reached over and turned up the radio. Jack smiled. They were going home. The dust had settled. The Black Vultures were no more. Jack and Emily had returned to their normal life, Or at least, as normal as it could be after everything that had happened. The small repair shop was open again, and Emily had her camera back in hand, capturing the beauty of the town that once felt so dangerous. But peace was a fragile thing. On the outskirts of town, parked just beyond the tree line, a blacked-out motorcycle idled quietly. Its rider sat still, his eyes hidden behind dark aviator shades, watching the repair shop from a distance. He took a slow drag from his cigarette, exhaling as he observed Jack stepping out onto the porch, stretching as he looked at the rising sun. "So, this is the guy who took down Victor," the rider muttered to himself. Behind him, several more motorcycles lined the road, not Black Vultures, but something much worse. Their jackets bore a different emblem, a blood-red serpent coiled around a skull. "The boss is gonna want to hear about this," another biker said, stepping forward. The leader flicked his cigarette to the ground, crushing it under his boot. "Let him enjoy his peace," he said with a smirk. "It won't last." With that, the engines roared to life, and the new threat disappeared into the morning haze. Back at the shop, Jack leaned against the porch railing, sipping his coffee. Something didn't sit right. He had spent years relying on his instincts. They had kept him alive in war, in battle, and now, in the chaos of civilian life. And right now, those instincts whispered a warning. Emily stepped outside, her camera slung around her neck. Jack took a slow sip of his coffee, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line beyond the shop. The early morning sun painted the landscape in gold, but something about the stillness gnawed at him. It was too quiet. He had spent too many years in too many war zones not to recognize when eyes were on him. Even now, in this so-called peaceful life, those instincts never faded. Behind him, Emily stretched with a soft yawn, adjusting the strap of her camera. "You okay?" she asked, tilting her head. Jack didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, let his senses drink in every detail. The smell of oil and steel from the shop. The distant hum of a passing truck on the highway. The lingering scent of cigarette smoke, not his. His jaw tightened. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice even. "Just thinking." Emily chuckled. Dangerous habit. Jack allowed himself a small smirk, but his mind was already moving. If someone had been watching the shop, why now? The Black Vultures were done. He had seen to that himself. So who else had an interest in him? Emily took a few steps forward, lifting her camera to snap a picture of the rising sun. The shutter clicked once, twice. Then, she paused. "That's weird," she murmured. Jack turned his attention to her. "What is?" She lowered the camera, squinting toward the road. "I swear I saw something. Looked like movement in the trees." Jack's grip tightened on his mug. He didn't turn right away. Instead, he kept his body relaxed, his posture casual, while his mind worked through the possibilities. Recon. Intimidation. Or something worse. Emily shook her head. "Maybe I'm just seeing things." Jack didn't respond right away. Instead, he took another slow sip of his coffee, using the moment to mask the way his mind worked through the details. Emily wasn't the type to imagine things. If she saw something, there was a good chance someone had been out there. Still, he couldn't let her worry. "Could be a deer," he said evenly, finally turning his gaze toward the road. The trees stood still now, bathed in the early morning light. Nothing out of place. Nothing obvious. That's what bothered him. Emily exhaled, rolling her shoulders. "Yeah, probably. Or maybe my brain's just playing tricks on me." She turned back toward the shop, stepping up onto the porch. "Anyway, I'm heading into town later. Gonna grab some shots of the train yard. You need anything while I'm out?" Jack hesitated for half a second before shaking his head. "I'm good." Emily smiled, ruffling his hair as she passed. "All right, Grumpy." Jack grunted in response, but his eyes never left the tree line. Something was out there. Someone. And if they were watching, they had a reason. He set his coffee down and stepped off the porch, stretching like he was just waking up, keeping his movements casual. But every step brought him closer to the tree line, where the scent of lingering cigarette smoke still clung to the air. He crouched near the dirt, eyes narrowing. Tracks. Boot prints, partially covered by the morning dew, leading away toward the road. Not Black Vultures. Someone new. Jack exhaled slowly. They were watching him, studying him. Big mistake. His fingers brushed against the dirt before he rose to his full height, rolling his shoulders. If they wanted to watch him, fine. But the next time they got close, they wouldn't walk away. But Jack knew better. She wasn't. His coffee suddenly didn't taste as good. Whoever they were, they had made one mistake. They had let him see them first. "Morning, Dad," she said, snapping a quick photo of him before he could protest. Jack smirked. "Morning, kiddo." She studied him for a moment, then asked, "You okay?" Jack took another sip of his coffee, his eyes drifting toward the horizon. "Yeah, just got a feeling," he muttered. Emily frowned. "A bad one?" Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he set his cup down and pulled her into a one-armed hug. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice firm but gentle, "we'll handle it. Together." Emily didn't fully understand what he meant. Not yet. But soon she would. Because trouble was coming. And this time, it was bigger than ever.